Alright everybody, this is Matt Webb with UT Extension in Marshall County. And the reason for this short recording is I want to tell you about a man named E.B. Wright, who was an emergency demonstration agent from August 24, 1917 to 1922. And the reason it's called an emergency demonstration agent is that during the years of 1915 and 1916, the county government would not appropriate funding for the extension service. And so this was during the war effort in World War One, and so emergency agents were sent all across the country to help farmers with the war effort. And so there's some neat history with him and how it relates to our Farm Bureau here in Marshall County. But he worked a lot with crops. One of his first things they did was try to encourage farmers to grow wheat for the Liberty Wheat Drive. Wheat had become a crop that was not profitable because the soil fertility had gotten pretty low in parts of the county. So low in part that there was no wheat to be sown in the northern part of the county. So he focused on the central and southern portions of the county and introduced different fertilizers, nitrogen fertilizer, phosphate. And the county average at that time was only 7 bushels an acre, and he was able to raise it up to 10 or 12 bushels an acre with some of the producers that he worked with. He worked with cover crops. We are all fond of the bright red flowers in the spring from crimson clover, and crimson clover was very popular at that time. And so I have no doubt that's probably part of the reason why we see so much of that in the springtime is from those farmers who used it in his promotion of that cover crop at that time. He worked on coming up with a dependable hay crops because you have to understand during those days there was no fescue. We're talking about 1917, 1922. Kentucky 31 fescue was not discovered until 1931 on a hillside in Kentucky and was not released as a variety until 1943. So they did not have a very dependable hay crop. So alfalfa was a crop that they chose to pursue. A lot of people were skeptical about whether they could grow it or not because they had failed numerous times. But through the encouragement of using lime and a knockling on the seed, they were able to give folks a more dependable hay crop. One demonstrator had a stand that was so good it did 5 tons of good alfalfa hay to the acre, which is still a very respectable yield in our current time. He worked a lot with youth to encourage new practices. He worked a lot with those boys about using hybrid seed corn. Back in those days, a lot of people saved seed. He encouraged the use of hybrid seed corn, proper cultivation methods, and the use of fertilizer. And so, as an example, a lot of the boys who were in the project grew corn that yielded better than their daddies. Frank Houston was one such boy. He grew a crop according to how the extension agent told him to grow it, and his out-yielded his daddy's by 13 bushels to an acre. I want to also point out this was a record that the extension agent kept at that time in 1918, and no prizes were given for this project. The reason for that is that they did not have a fair for the influenza. That's the only time I found in the records that he mentioned flu. Most of everything that was talked about was for the war effort at that time. Little girls were also part of clubs back then. This is a girls sewing club at Verona. Home demonstration agent started in 1919, and she's worked with the girls. There was a project called a tenth of an acre garden. So this young lady here on the right, she has her 6 rows of tomatoes, which would have been a fairly new crop at that time. And she had 4 rows of onions and 2 rows of butter beans in her garden. There was a new crop called soybeans, which at that time was used more of a hay crop. It replaced cowpeas. And then when Mr. Wright got here, he recognized the orchards were in bad shape, so he did several printing demonstrations. And this is probably one of the first examples of somebody using a sprayer in an orchard in this part of the world. So a lot of things that he did was associated with the growing food. Labor was a problem then, as it is now. This is a picture. These are some businessmen from Lewisburg that came out of town and helped the farmers during the harvest. Another example of trying to come up with help for the labor issue. Um, there's a sentence here that says the authorities in Lewisburg gave the loafers of town an opportunity to go to work or go to jail. They decided to go to work. Another reason working with labor is that tractors were introduced. There wasn't many tractors in the county at that time, and the extension agent at that time kept up with anybody who had a tractor and did a demonstration here with an Avery tractor. Most producers at that time used Fordsons or International tractors, but they did have a big demonstration and encouraged the use of tractors. And going back to what I mentioned before about the use of lime, the machine there on the bottom and then the one in the right hand side, that is a lime pulver. And so they would go out and collect limestone rock and grind it, pulverize it, and then spread that lime out on the fields. Did a lot of work with livestock, particularly on the dairy, because there was a creamery in Chapel Hill at that time and later on in Lewisburg. That cow there in the bottom left hand corner sold for $800. So it was a pretty good sum of money at that time. I did a lot of work with the producers with hogs, because a lot of them used hogs to hog off corn and crops, a lot of Poland Chinas. There's a lot of beef cattle that got shipped out of the county by train. He encouraged the use of chickens and particularly purebred flocks. And then donkeys and mules was actually a pretty good commodity here in the county at one time. There was a few years there that a lot of the state winners came out of Marshall County. Fuel was undoubtedly a problem one winter because they ran out of coal, and the agent worked with some people, some farmers, and they hauled timber to town so that the people would not freeze to death here in Lewisburg. Home improvements. If you look at the picture there, you'll notice that there is power poles, so electricity was becoming more available. And he wrote down a lot about how many homes in the county had electricity, how many homes had indoor plumbing, and so that was an interesting period of time, I'm sure. Every little town at that time here in the county had their own fair. The picture on the right, I just thought that was a real neat picture. Those are some children there with their baby dolls, and they had a buggy show there in Chapel Hill, so I thought that was a real neat deal. Parades was, as they are now, was a popular thing. Everybody, I'm sure, would get their best horse out, and you notice there's a lot of cars there in that bottom left-hand corner, and so that at the time was still a big deal for people to get out and socialize with each other. And other means of socializing. There's a group there. They're playing with a medicine ball there around Hardison Mills. There's some people up there at the top around Wright Station. They're getting acquainted. They're having dinner on the ground in Verona. There was a corn show, and then there was a poultry show there in 1920. So people got out and done things. They needed that interaction, as I'm sure most of us realize now after the year we've had. But this is what I finally wanted to get to. In 1919, the extension agents at the time, Mr. Wright and the home demonstration agent, they worked with a group of people and they formed what was Marshall County Council of Agriculture. There was 15 folks on there. There's a picture of those individuals there in the top right-hand corner. And going back to what I mentioned before, the reason that they were called emergency agents is because the county government at that time would not fund those positions. But it says here, the Council of Agriculture has backed up the work of the county agents. The appropriations for county agents' work was presented to the county court by the council and secured without trouble. And then, I'm sure now we all realize that Farm Bureau started in Tennessee in 1921. This was written in his report in 1920, what I just read. And then in 1922, this was in his report. Is there a central county committee supporting your work? And he says, yes. If so, what are they called? They're the Executive Committee, Marshall County Farm Bureau. And so I thought that was a real neat of Farm Bureau history, but also the extension history of the county and how they partnered up and that we enjoy some of those benefits from that partnership today. So I thought that was just some real neat history from Marshall County.